All right, there we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome back, or for the first time, hopefully, to Crusade Against Ignorance. Today, got something I'm really excited for. We're going to hopefully just completely obliterate any objections anyone might have to socialism. So it's a great project. Joining me once again for the second time is Dr. Dustin Crummett. Dustin, thank you for coming back.
Oh, sure. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, good to have you. So today I think we're just going to go through, we'd planned on just kind of starting off by going through some basic definitions of what socialism is, what capitalism is, why socialists don't like capitalism, and vice versa. And then we'll spend like the main body chunk of the video going through the most popular objections people have, or in some cases think they have, to socialism, and kind of hopefully dissuade some worries about those. So I guess if we want to just jump right into it, we can kind of, I guess the broader project is like the case for socialism, but the main thing will be answering objections. So if we want to just start off, then Dustin, we can go through like kind of defining what we mean by socialism, because there's a lot of misconceptions about this, and this is where really like almost the majority of objections you hear to socialism aren't really about socialism at all, at least online. So it is a broad political system, and some people tend to think it means like total government control. In the more, the classics of the tradition, it's more so about worker control. So I've got a couple definitions here, but why don't we start off with you talking a little bit about kind of what socialism is and what people get wrong about it, some common misconceptions, and just kind of get that out of the way if you want to start with that.
Yeah. I mean, it is funny in sort of ordinary political discourse. Socialism can mean anything from totalitarianism to you support Obamacare to you voted for Bernie Sanders and all these. But I mean, typically the thought is something like capital goods, the stuff that you use to produce other things, resources, factories, all these sorts of things, the means of production. These in a capitalist system are privately owned, either by individuals or by corporations or whatever. The corporations, in turn, being owned by lots of different individuals, generally. In a socialist system, these things are owned in some way publicly or collectively, either by the state or by worker cooperatives, or something like that. So something like this is kind of the core difference. There are situations in which you might kind of wonder, the line. I mean, these are sort of ideal types, and so there are possible institutional arrangements where the line gets blurred in certain ways. But that's what the core difference is supposed to be. And then there are also lots of other features that are sort of often contingently associated with these two different types of arrangements. So if you think about, capitalism, a free market is supposed to, oftentimes people think is part of capitalism. These wage labor is a big part of capitalism. These sorts of things are kind of not built into the definition, but often sort of contingently associated with these types of arrangements.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Yeah, so because we talked about a little bit, sometimes people conflate socialism. You said with anything, to the left of like just hunting the homeless. But other times it's more narrowly defined. So like, because there's also egalitarianism and distributive justice, which we'll talk about a little bit, which is basically the idea that, equality should be, generally speaking, a goal or advanced as well as possible. And so like, egalitarians are generally going to be for wealth redistribution. But again, these things are not socialism. The socialism and capitalism dichotomy is more so about like ownership and control, right? And so there's a really good current affairs article on this by Rob Larson and Nathan J. Robinson called Ownership and Control, and pointing out how like just socialists and capitalists have different ideas about what ownership and control and freedom really means.
Right.
So yeah, so some definitions of socialism are weaker. I mean, there's a really good article, the one I cited for kind of the outline for this, the Defining Capitalism and Socialism by Thomas Metcalf, basically says what you said, that it's just like socialism is just a system in which the capital goods are socially owned or controlled, possibly by a government, but not necessarily. So that's why it's people. We'll talk about some of this later, but people make blanket claims about like governments, and that's not an intrinsic feature of socialism. But so then it's probably fair to say, right, I mean, socialism is compatible with markets to an extent, even free markets. There's entire schools of thought actually that are centered around this. So, yeah. So we'll get into that later, because a lot of the objections are going to come from like the free market school, or they think they're objections, but they're really not. So that's generally socialist outlook, and contrasted with capitalism is private. So maybe we can talk a little bit briefly, since we're kind of building up sort of case here for socialism along the way. Maybe briefly cover like what the major, because we don't want to be on defensive the whole time, right? So what are some of like the major socialist like critiques of capitalism? What are some reasons why? I guess we'll probably, as we go forwards, we'll talk more about the practical stuff. We can cover that now if we need to, but maybe just even like at a moral level or a distributive justice level, what are some reasons that we might prefer socialism to capitalism? What advantages does it have, and what are some of the major critiques?
Yeah, so I think it might be an understanding what the socialist objection to capitalism is. It might be helpful to kind of start out by thinking about maybe a pure capitalist system, sort of a laissez-faire, totally there's no wealth redistribution, the sort of system that kind of hard right libertarians want. And then there's a further question about the extent to which these objections apply to sort of mixed systems, to social democracy, welfare state capitalism, that sort of stuff. But if we have the sort of pure laissez-faire capitalism, typically that's going to be associated, just like I said, capitalism as an abstract idea is often associated with all sorts of other things in practice. Typically, you're going to have, private ownership of capital goods. These goods are also transferable. You can give them to other people or sell them to other people. We allow for absentee ownership. So I can own things without using them myself. I can own a factory even if I don't work in the factory, or I might own shares in many different companies even though I don't work for any of these companies, right? And also, there's not going to be limits on capital accumulation. So I can kind of get more and more over time. And it's not the case either that it's going to be redistributed, or that the government is going to step in and say, all right, Jeff Bezos, you have $5 billion of Amazon stock. You just can't get any more. Like, the value of the stock increases. We're going to have to take away some of it, give it to, And so if you think about this, insofar as I'm laboring, I mean, there are only so many hours in the day, right? I can only have so many jobs. So there are going to be some limits on how much wealth I can accumulate. Insofar as I'm owning capital in a system like this, well, I can make money from the capital I have and then reinvest it into more capital and reinvest it into more capital. And so the amount of wealth I have can kind of go like this over time, right? Because there's no limit on my ability to accumulate capital. And because of this, you can sort of expect that maybe like even with kind of small initial differences in, say, how efficient somebody is in investing and how much capital they have, whatever, that over time, more and more of the capital is going to be captured by fewer and fewer people, right? It could even be, Thomas Piketty wrote this book a couple years ago about capital, where he wanted to argue that the rate of return on capital tends to exceed the growth rate of the economy as a whole, which means not only that more and more of the capital is captured by people, a small group of people, but the people who own the capital are also going to be capturing a greater and greater share of the economy over time. And ultimately, they'll just own everything. Fortunately, he thinks that periodically in history, there have been sort of catastrophes, world wars and things that destroyed a bunch of the capital and prevented this, this total capture. But even if that's not right, it is going to be the case that capital is going to get concentrated into a small number of hands. So I'm born. And I don't have any capital, let's say. I'm born into a poor family. Well, what am I going to do? I mean, I have myself, right? I don't own any resources. I don't own any factories, whatever. So I own myself, and I can kind of do anything that I can just do without having to make use of other resources. So maybe I can come up with some great idea. Maybe I can offer somebody kind of some sort of service. Most likely what's going to happen is that I'm going to have to go and find somebody who does own capital and make an agreement with them. I'll sell you my labor. I'm going to work in your factory. And then you're going to own the stuff that I make, right? And so then we go. I have to go, and this is what most people are going to have to do, is they're going to go work in the factory or work in the restaurant, provide a service, do whatever. And all of the profit is going to go to the people who own the stuff, who often may not be doing any work at all. Because, of course, in modern capitalist systems, big firms, ownership is divorced from management. Like the CEO is not the person who owns the company. The person who is employed by the company works for all these shareholders, right? So it could very well be that all of this profit is going to somebody who inherited a trust fund and put a broker in charge of it, has never done anything productive at all, but is just kind of sitting there reaping profits. Now, they are taking risks. If the firm goes under, then they lose their money, and I don't lose any money. But as long as they have enough to sort of diversify their investments and stuff, then in the aggregate, the risks they're taking are not very big. And so when we have a system like this, first of all, we're going to be like, this doesn't really seem very fair. I'm doing all the work. The firm is making all this profit. I don't see any of this profit. All of this profit is going to this guy who inherited the trust fund. And, you know, other people maybe who, if it's a corporation, other people who own stocks, right? And this is, Marx had a somewhat involved theory of exploitation. The workers are being exploited by the capitalists, which relied in some way on the labor theory of value, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later. But you don't really need the labor theory of value to just sort of look at this and say, well, this doesn't really seem fair. Second, you know, I don't have, particularly if I'm an unskilled worker, if there are lots of potential replacements for me, I don't have very much leverage against my employers to fight for better working conditions, to have any control over the, you know, what I'm doing. And so I can be forced to work, you know, long hours for little pay, lots of drudgery. And I'm not even really invested in what I'm doing because I'm not seeing any of the profits, right? I don't own this thing that I'm making. I might just be doing some repetitive job. This is related to the classic Marxist theory of alienation. The workers are, I should say, by the way, that I'm not a Marxist. I'm just kind of surveying some of the common objections, some of which I think have something to them, even though I'm not a Marxist. Right. But this is the idea of that capitalism is alienating. You are kind of divorced from, you know, people have this urge to do creative, autonomous work, to want to, you know, take pride in what they've produced, but you're actually being divorced from the thing you're actually making. You know, you might not ever even see the finished product. Even if you did, it's not yours. There's this related criticism about domination in the workplace. Elizabeth Anderson had a very good book called Private Government, where she says, look, most workers are essentially laboring in dictatorships for 8 hours every day, because, again, they have no control over their working conditions. They have very little recourse if their boss mistreats them. You have those sorts of worries. You also have sort of general worries that arise because this process is going to create lots of wealth inequality. You have general worries that arise from that. Rich people are going to have an awful lot of influence over the political process. We know that in the U.S., what the government actually does is empirically like almost unaffected by the views of people who are outside of, kind of the top, I don't know, 10% or whatever of wealth holders. So lots of people no longer have any say in the political process. That's bad for all sorts of reasons. Lots of people are going to sort of fall through the cracks. And so there's a whole family of objections, some of which have to do with kind of the fairness of the arrangement itself, with this exploitative relationship, others which have to do with the power imbalance, others of which have to do with kind of the broader social effects, that all target at least this laissez-faire form of capitalism. Then I suppose the question becomes, is it possible to constrain the abuses of capitalism through social democracy, or do you actually really need to socialize the means of production? I think that, at least everybody within that debate has their heart sort of in the right place. And of course, there are cases, there are sort of borderline cases. Is Norway is supposed to be, this is welfare state capitalism or whatever, but Norway, the government owns 60% of the wealth in the country. Like, that sounds pretty socialized. So there are also borderline cases here. But I think that's sort of where people broadly from this part of the political spectrum are coming from. I hope all that made sense.
Yeah, no, that was great. I really liked it. Yeah, so in terms of like why we would prefer preventing that system, but we'll go through some of this as we move along, and as you said, we'll cover some of those points. But like, I think like the most simplest way that this has been put, and the most effective way, was by Noam Chomsky, who I actually, if you guys can see, but I'm wearing my Chomsky shirt today, so I had to represent for this video. But basically the idea that like, it's pretty obvious, at least, empirically, and this is pretty easy to see just from the armchair, but especially the empirical effects, the reason, like, that this kind of the system you sketched out, that inequality is undesirable, is because concentration of wealth equals concentration of power, right? And you touched on it, like, with people don't really have much say in the political process, because obviously, private interests and corporate interests and all this wealth concentration affects public policy. And so, then the way it turns out is like this ideal libertarian world where they, hate the government so much, actually turns into like one of the most like authoritarian things you could imagine in terms of power redistribution, because wealth is definitely tied to power. So Chomsky's documentary Requiem for the American Dream is one I'd recommend anybody for the intro to that, and kind of specifically the founding of American values. But
you can just think about, if you think about earlier periods in the U.S. where we were really something closer to a laissez-faire capitalist system in the late 19th and early 20th century, workers who had to work 12-hour days for almost no money and got locked, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, everybody was locked in the building so they couldn't take breaks outside and died, burned to death. Do those people seem more or less free to you than people in Norway?
Right. Yeah, and sometimes there's this like dichotomy drawn between like government power being bad and private power being bad. But I think one thing we'll address as we go on is like one reason to prefer public power. And one thing I think that's important, and we'll get when we address some objections, it's like arguing for socialized control of public ownership and control of means of production isn't to endorse like every instance of government ownership of those things, because sometimes that can be run undemocratically. And so this is the point I've stressed about socialism, is it's inherently like just adamantly democratic. And so if there's kind of like a government system in place with public ownership that's undemocratic, that's kind of not really in line with what I take to be true socialist values. And I think that's kind of backed up by a lot of the socialist tradition. And so, but the one reason maybe to prefer like public ownership through the government even, I think we both expressed before, we're kind of sympathetic to more like libertarian socialism. So we actually do share some of like the state skepticism about state power. But like one reason to prefer at least ideal public ownership is with governments that are run democratically, you do have the ability to vote on policies and like actually have some say in how like, you know, these things are run. Whereas in a, you know, the capitalist system, you don't really have that. So basically my point with that is like not all government instances of socialism are created equal. So we'll address that point more as we go on. But yeah, so people, you know, there's often this conflation. I think you touched on this, like between socialism and just like welfare. But, you know, generally like welfare systems are kind of these contingent parts of generally socialist, broadly egalitarian societies. And we'll touch on why as we go forward. So we'll maybe spend some time answering objections to general, like, you know, people have like problems with general social welfare programs. But so we'll address some of those. But generally speaking, it's not really all that relevant to socialism itself. Okay, yeah, so we touched on kind of some introductory reasons why we'd prefer socialism to capitalism, kind of the basic levels of problems we have. So is there anything else, or should we get into some of the objections?
Oh, I think those were sort of the main things that I wanted to say, probably.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I've kind of broken up the objections section here, which Dustin's already seen, but for the sake of the audience, into three main sections here, which is just kind of like some very basic objections that are very common. And these are the ones that are what I'd call like the bad objections, the one that don't really have much to do with socialism, or they're just not well thought out. So that's the first section we'll talk about. And then after that, we'll talk about some specifically economic arguments. And all three sections will have some crossover. But so the second kind of portion we'll do is just some particularly economic objections people have. So people have issues with like central planning. And then the last section is the one I'm most excited for because this is the most philosophically rigorous objection series. It would be like the philosophical objections, specifically the ones about redistributive justice that come out of like Robert Nozick and kind of just the general like libertarian philosophy and objections it has based on like individual rights. So we'll finish off with what I take to be the best objections to socialism, at least that I've encountered so far. But before that, we'll have to wade through some not so good objections. So without further ado, let's just get one out of the way here. Look at Venezuela. What do you say to this, Dustin? Can you handle it?
Checkmate.
Right.
Yeah. Venezuela is not doing well in all sorts of ways. Of course, there are also, I mean, if you look at Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, say, there are plenty of examples of capitalist systems that have not done very well either. Yeah, I mean, we're all agreed that Venezuela is not a model to copy, but nothing of significance really follows from that.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, no, so this is kind of one of those more joke points. We won't spend too much time on this. I have an older video on the channel I did like 15 minutes long called Thinking Critically About Socialism. So if you really want more extensive answer to the, you know, Venezuela, Cuba, look at the USSR, the Nazis were socialist, all that crap. I did a whole video on that because it's too common. But basically, it's, you know, anybody who's, you know, listened though so far, even if you were sympathetic to this point, it should be pretty obvious that the way we've laid out socialism, it doesn't have anything to do with these highly authoritarian governments that just so, because again, there's no semblance of anything like democracy in those systems. So, nothing really of importance there. So that one was more just a joke point. This is one that's interesting, this next one. I don't think it's a good objection, and maybe it's just because I really don't know what the hell it's supposed to mean half the time. But there's the objection that people bring it up for socialism and communism and Marxism, which are all different things, but people don't understand it all. I'll just like Dustin, I'll preface I'm not a Marxist. I'm just sympathetic to some Marxist critiques, especially since I've been reading up on it more. But so this is one that I don't know, maybe you can elucidate for me what people more so mean by this, but people will often say, like, socialism contradicts human nature. More so I hear it about communism, like, oh, communism or socialism will never work. This is the stock objection, is people will just say, oh, it sounds good in theory, but it doesn't fit with human nature, so we got to throw it out. And I guess this is more of a practical objection. I guess part of the reason I don't know what the hell this means is I don't know what human nature is. I don't even know if that exists. I'm not quite sure what that, even if it does, I don't know what problems it has with democracy. But yeah, So this isn't one that I think is a good objection. It's just one I hear a lot. So I'm kind of, and it's one I'm sure people are, sympathetic to, generally speaking. So what do you think about this one? Do you make more sense of it than I do, or?
Yeah, I mean, so the I take it that what people have in mind when they are saying something like that is socialism requires some very large amount of altruism on the part of individuals within the system. Everybody's supposed to be working for the greater good, and et cetera, et cetera. And people are just not set up like that. People are very selfish. People are going to be freeloaders if you let them do that. And so just it's not going to function because it requires too much altruism on the part of people. I think, I mean, what to say in response to that? One thing is just that, well, I mean, sometimes people are pretty altruistic. I mean, particularly when there are big, when it's in line with sort of, big social movements or societies. I mean, people volunteer to go fight in wars and stuff under conditions where they don't really stand to benefit very much from that. So sometimes people are pretty altruistic. Another thing to say is that when you give people kind of decent working conditions, when you give them jobs that they're invested in, where they can be creative, where they can act autonomously, oftentimes they are willing to work hard for reasons other than the profit motive, right? They're willing to work hard because they are enjoying what they're doing. They're trying to do a good job. People in academia and research, and all sorts of fields, you can see all sorts of people who really try to do a good job because they like what they're doing and not because they're particularly going to make any more money through doing a good job. But the third thing is that it's not like socialism requires you to not rely on the profit motive at all. There are certain modes of socialist organization that might. If you maybe on a collective farm, if we're just all going to share everything that we make at the end of the day and nobody is made to work or anything, you can imagine, okay, well, it's just let somebody else do it. If you've ever had, like a roommate who would just let things get really dirty and the expectation that you would eventually clean it up. And, yeah, I mean, people do that sort of stuff. But it's not like commitment to social ownership of the means of control means that you're committed to not paying people who, more if they perform better or if they work harder. Doesn't mean that you're committed to letting yourself be taken advantage of by freeloaders, that sort of stuff. We can talk maybe more about particular socialist modes of organization and how they might try to avoid that in a little bit when we talk about some of the economic objections. But
Yeah, the other thing I'd say to it is, like, again, as I said, I'm not even quite sure that there is such a thing as human nature, at least one that's the same across all people. But there's also this kind of, like, again, almost Marxist point about how much material conditions do affect action and nature. So that's another line of response too, is like, you only think it contradicts human nature because your conception of human nature is so seeped in, like, this capitalist ideological look at what humans should be and what production should look like. So there's some more food for thought there, but I think those are also some good general points.
It's certainly true that what sort of stuff people are willing to do is affected heavily by kind of the ethos in a society, by what sorts of things we attach prestige to, that sort of stuff. I mean, yeah, if I was working as a janitor at Walmart and I wasn't required to work hard, I mean, yeah, I would. Like, why would I try to do a really good job at my job? I mean, I don't have any investment in the success of Walmart. But that doesn't mean that people are never willing to try to work hard for reasons other than the profit motive, in conditions where they feel like what they're doing is valuable, where it's something that is socially valued and so on.
Right. Okay. Cool. Thanks. So there's this other one too, which I think will actually, again, some of these will build on as we go along because there's a later points I have, but there are some objections actually, and you touched on this, that you get to socialism from people who are generally sympathetic to leftism, and these are people who are social democrats who are like, I'm all for wealth redistribution, I'm all for like broadly egalitarian policy, but I'm not, and we'll talk about this more with the economic point because their objection generally is just that, and maybe we can cover it here. I don't know. We'll see if there's any more need to. But they basically say that, like, these kind of like socialist elements of a society that we want, like broadly egalitarian policies and like welfare, it only works when you have capitalism to create that much wealth. And this is a point people use also against like Marx. But Marx even like conceded that, like, this goes in stages, right? Like the capitalists produce and they have to first produce enough wealth to enable the proletariat revolution. So Marx completely recognized all that and predicted it. But again, Marx's predictions didn't always turn out. So, but there is this general objection, right, that like that the people on the left make, and I think you said earlier that like these people are coming from the right place. They're actually saying like we want, like welfare systems and things, but the only way to really have that is to let capital produce all this wealth and then just kind of rein it back in with like, some mixed economic market regulation. So they'll say that like, the Nordic model is like ideal. That's what we need, right? We need to just like leave the ownership in private hands so it produces all this wealth. And then we'll just kind of like have a strong welfare state to kind of like redistribute that. And that's like the ideal system. And so there's a really good article on this if anybody's interested in reading it. Specifically about this issue called Social Democracy is Good But Not Good Enough by Jacobin magazine. And it talks about how, the Nordic countries aren't really socialist, but they do disprove a lot of American talking points about socialism, about, just like things like universal health care, right? Because they have all that, the entire industrialized world has all that. But yeah, so I wonder what you could say, what you would say more to this about like, to kind of have a lot of these social, generally egalitarian, I guess is a better way to put it, institutions that socialists want, we need to be able to pay for those, right? So we have to produce all this wealth. And the best way to produce all that wealth is to have this private ownership. So, and socialize, and the point social democrats will also make is like, socializing and having worker controlled means of production is going to like remove this capitalist incentive that spurs on all this innovation and technological advancement and wealth production. So I'd originally planned that for later, but I guess that's most of that objection there. So we can just go through that now if you want to.
Yeah, I think there's something right there. Capitalism does create a lot of wealth, and particularly it seems like markets play a lot of important economic roles. And particularly, when you look at people, there are some people who regard markets there are some socialists who regard markets as just objectionable in and of themselves. But when you look at what they want to replace it with, oftentimes it's either just the market with extra steps. We'll give people these kind of, initially we are going to have to ration stuff somehow so people don't just take too much stuff. So everybody will get like vouchers when they work, and then you can exchange. And so now this is just money and you just have a market again. Or else they often kind of look a little bit crazy. Well, okay, we're all just going to return to, being agrarian freeholders, and there just won't be any consumer goods anyway. And neither of those seem that great. So I guess my view is that you do probably need markets for various important economic functions. Does that mean that you need capitalism in the sense of in the sense of the capital largely being privately owned? Well, maybe not. Again, in large firms, ownership is already divorced from management. The people who actually run the company are not the people who own the company. And similarly, when it comes to investment, lots of investment is not done by particular individuals. It's done by funds or by big company, Morgan Stanley. It's done by big funds that, again, are managed by people who are not the people who have who themselves own the capital, right? So right now we have a system where we have all these markets, we have all these firms. All this stuff is being run by managers, and then it's owned by private individuals, usually by rich people. Well, what if, and this is a proposal that Matt Bruenig is very, very into, what if you just had the state buy up all the capital? You could still have markets. There would still be firms. And you could still have capital markets. You could still have stock markets. You would still have investment, all this sort of stuff. But all of it would ultimately be socially controlled. The state would control the investment funds. And through those, the state would own the companies. And as a result, everything could work basically the way it does now, except that all of the profit, instead of going to individual shareholders, goes to the state, which can then maybe distribute it out to everybody in the form of a UBI or something like that. And this is already, Alaska does this sort of with some of their oil sales. The state has a permanent fund that's funded by the oil sales, and they just give everybody a check once a year. Norway has a big sovereign wealth fund. And again, Norway, the government owns 60% of the wealth in the country, so it's not quite like private ownership is not really what's driving the economy in Norway, right? I mean, maybe to some extent. And so if you did that, that doesn't itself say give workers control in their firms. So you would want to do other stuff too. Have regulations concerning how firms are managed internally, have rules for how workers can be treated, that sort of stuff. So you'd want to have other stuff too, in addition to that, to kind of fully realize your socialist ideals. And you might also want to, you could allow small amounts of private capital that would maybe fund, entrepreneurs and that sort of thing. That would probably be okay. But in this way, you would be able, the hope at least is, you would be able to kind of benefit from the big surplus that's created through these capitalist mechanisms, through the markets in goods and in capital and so on. But it's just, and the profit would go to everybody instead of going to a few people. So seems fine. So now, maybe there are problems with that, but at least because, again, there are some sort of smaller scale models where this seems to work all right. It seems at least worth investigating whether this could scale up. So that's one particular way of implementing market socialism, which would allow things to work largely the way that they do now, which would allow for kind of an easy transition. We wouldn't need year zero. You just need the state to go around buying up index funds. So there's no reason, the financial instruments to do this to a large extent already exist. And then you can keep production going. It's just that it benefits everybody instead of a smaller group of people.
Okay. Yeah, I like it. Hey, we'll talk a little more about that and like markets and the connection in the next section. We talk about economic objections, but that's a very good intro. Because I hear that a lot from people who are sympathetic to social democracy. And I think also the point the Jacobin article makes is good, is that kind of like as socialists, we take, democratic control and people having control over their own lives, even in the workplace, to be something that's kind of just like intrinsically valuable, and, people need to have control. So there's kind of this point about like, even if we can have these broad welfare programs, it's like we still want people to, generally speaking, have a modicum of control over their own lives. That's one reason, again, to prefer socialist methods of control, ownership, and all that. But
and this is one reason why I said I think that if you did something like this, it might help with that, actually, because if you have everybody is in a way a capitalist now, because everybody gets funds, gets their dividend from the public fund. That makes your exit rights a little more realizable in principle. It's going to be easier if you lose your job, if you walk away from your job, say, because your employer won't give you the good working conditions. It's going to be easier for you to manage than in a system where you have no other source of income, and so you're utterly dependent on your employer. But also, this is why I said, yeah, you want to have other things too,
Right.
Affecting maybe the governance of firms, this sort of stuff. Which will, a lot of people are very into worker-owned firms, which is fine. It's sort of hard, I think, to scale them up, and it creates certain problems. I mean, we could talk about this if you wanted to, but it's a little. I doubt that like worker cooperatives are a model that could work for the whole economy. But you can do things within firms to make them much more democratic, to give workers more of a say in what they're doing. Whether it's through unions, through rules about governance, through putting worker representatives on the board of the company,
Okay, yeah, that's great. That's a good intro, and we'll expound on that. I feel like I did these out of order because the next one or two are pretty bad. I feel like that was a pretty decent objection, right? Like I can very much respect that point of just because partially because of where it's coming from, right? Of just being we want welfare programs, so we want to make have a system that's most effective at giving people that. So I appreciate where it's coming from, and I think it's actually a decent point about production and all that. But so the next two are going to be underwhelming. Actually, I'm not even going to do this other one. I had one written down that I got some of these. There was a National Review article where they compiled all these these writers have these all this objections to socialism, and the Current Affairs editor Nathan Robinson wrote a whole piece debunking the whole thing. It was called the best they've got. It's supposed to make these best objections to socialism, and one of them was just that socialism is incompatible with democracy, and so I had that written down. But that's not even worth because as we already defined it as a democratic system, so it's just a category error. So the last one on this kind of or actually, one of the next ones, actually there's a couple more, but this bad objections section is just, and this we won't spend too much time on, basically, is people just say, this is particularly American objection, when people just say, oh, it's against the Constitution, or it's against American values. And I think the larger point here is something we'll address later, because the Constitution people take to be generally this kind of conservative / libertarian, broadly neoliberal conception about rights. So the brunt of this point we'll address later. But I mean, there's not really any intrinsic worth in American values, I don't think. So that's not really one. That one's not worth talking about too much, because there's no reason to prima facie prefer the Constitution or American values apart from any argument there. So we don't have to spend too much time on that one. But I think
I suppose it might, in connection to that, it might be worth thinking about. I mean, to the extent that we would think of the founding fathers as libertarians or whatever, they were heavily influenced by Locke, by that sort of tradition of thought. And of course, they didn't implement this very consistently because you got slavery, and that's but okay, but set that aside. Suppose we want sort of the most charitable reading. Elizabeth Anderson in The Same Private Government, I think gives kind of a good historical analysis of these sort of Lockean ideas. Look, you obtain ownership of natural resources through mixing your labor with the world, through doing work, through leaving as good and as much for others, and then you sort of should be allowed to go around and make free exchanges. I mean, in the Lockean context, if you were someone who was sympathetic to this, what you would hope realizing these ideals would do is change your society from an aristocratic society to a society of sort of sole proprietors, of farmers working their own little plots of land, of craftsmen having the freedom to sell their goods in a market, whatever. And that all sounds pretty good, right? I mean, that's not a system where most people are wage laborers, where they're going to be huge lines, economic inequality, this sort of stuff. So that all sounds pretty good. It's not really clear that you can do that in a post-industrial society where lots of things are very capital intensive, right? How are you going to have sole proprietors of auto manufacturers? You can't just have individual craftsmen making cars and selling them to people on their own. So I think there's a case to be made that if you look not at the letter but at the spirit of these Lockean values, the sorts of things that in this context, in this sort of, the remnants of feudalism are still around, you're in an aristocratic society, the sorts of things that would make you think, realizing these values are very good, it would give people control over their own destinies, allow laborers to enjoy the fruits of their labor rather than, the baron of whatever way. Those sorts of things now should make you think, wait, these right libertarian ideas are actually really bad because what we're creating is this system where you have a small number of capitalists who everybody else are getting exploited by everybody else, right? So I think I point that all out to say, I mean, who knows what American values are, but to the extent that there are American values, which traditionally, was about individualism, about, respecting workers, about, those things might push away from kind of right libertarianism, given the sorts of economic conditions that we find ourselves in now, in the post-industrial revolution world. Jeffersonian democracy and everybody farming a little plot of land is not really possible anymore.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And we're planning to expand later some more on like the whole Lockean story about property entitlement and kind of why it's sort of problematic. But for here and now, that's a great little intro. So yeah, that's a good point, a good charitable reading of that. Because I had the same thing. I mean, the American values, I'm assuming that as kind of this like, rugged individualism, like up by your bootstraps, like, but as you said, like it's this sort of like the West, like the early American West, where you can just go off and like build a house somewhere and start a plot of land and like this rugged individualism. Like that's American values, but that has no application to what the world looks like now. So that's a good point. So this is something kind of along the same lines you talked about with like kind of maybe doing public ownership and a universal basic income, which I think is generally good because it's a bad idea, I think, and we'll agree. And we're kind of making the case to have, say, like your healthcare tied to your job, because then it's like, well, you really don't have any leverage, as you said, because you lose your job and you get sick, you could die, right? So it's really just a bad idea to have those things tied. But so when we talk about like having, say, a universal basic income, especially this point is raised, people just say, oh, well, if you do this, if you provide all these benefits, like have healthcare, have, even a basic income, have all this covered, people are just going to be lazy. They're just not going to work. They're just going to like stay at home and just reap these social benefits. And people make this too about the welfare state. Even now, they'll just be like, oh, people are just sitting at home and using their welfare checks for, like iPhones, and they don't really need it. And so people are just, if people are provided for by the government, they're just going to be lazy and not do anything. And that's not good, because people that are working are being taxed to pay for people who are not working at all. And that's just unjust. So there's kind of this like laziness argument people make, where it's like, oh, well, you have the government be like a nanny state, essentially. Well, people just aren't going to work. They're not going to be productive. They're not going to do anything. They're just going to be like social parasites. And I think, and another objection that comes along with this, like kind of in line with this, that I've heard like libertarians give me, is just like about healthcare. They're like, their objection to universalized healthcare is like, oh, I don't want my tax dollars paying for someone's like obesity treatment, because like, oh, obesity is like this huge thing in America. So people are going to get medical care for being fat, and like that's their decision, that's their fault, and I don't think it's fair for me to have to work to pay for that. And the simplest objection to that, I raised this to a friend once, or I told a friend about this, and his objection to it was basically something like, yeah, that's interesting, but like try telling like a 5-year-old child whose mother's dying of cancer that like she doesn't deserve treatment because the taxpayers didn't want to pay for fat people's obesity medicine. So I think that's obviously like pretty morally corrupted to just reduce the entire point to just, oh, I don't want to pay for people who are lazy. Like there's obviously definitely, but part of it's just this kind of like right-wing lie of that, people don't actually need these things. They're just being leeches, but which isn't true. So that's the simplest counter to this point, is like there really are people that need it. But they may run some sort of like anti-utilitarian argument against this, of like, oh, well, even if some people need it, some don't. So, how things turn out, my money is paying for people who don't need it, and that's not fair. So this is a point that, again, it's not like a good objection. It doesn't really have much to do with socialism as such in terms of ownership. But I think it kind of hits against this sort of like fundamental disagreement between kind of the contemporary left and the contemporary right, between like, how people should be taken care of. So you covered some of this generally, but is there anything more to say there, you think?
Probably not a whole lot. I mean, it is a little... I mean, it's funny to have people who are so concerned about the idea of a nanny state and all this sort of stuff really want the government to be in the business of, making these intensely moralized, like, well, you should have stopped the McDonald's, so we're going to let you die. Yeah, I mean, I'm in Germany. You don't pay. It's not a public health system exactly, but there is a universal healthcare system where there aren't deductibles or copays or anything like that, except maybe very small ones. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it's not like people are like, oh, well, now I'll just go and get lung cancer for fun because I know that the government's going to pay. And I mean, it's true that you might not need to make use of something, but that's just what insurance is, right? People who are lucky are subsidize the people who aren't. And even if you happen not to need health care at a certain point, well, I mean, you might have. And there's a good chance, because you can't be sure that you're going to be able to keep your job, because you can't be sure that you're not going to need health care. I mean, there's a good chance that the risk you avoid through a system that covers everybody is going to be better for you than, this alternate system where we have something more like what the U.S. has right now.
Yeah. I think... obviously points like along these lines are just super like devoid of any like level of empathy, but I think there's also like a broadly, and I know we're both like fans of kind of Rawlsian social contract ideals generally, and I think there's almost like a veil of ignorance argument we can make along Rawlsian lines for this, of like, well, you may not need the healthcare, but like not even for yourself. Think about like all the random mutations that could go along when you have children. Like your kid could have like any sort of like medical condition, and like ideally, wouldn't you want like a society to ensure that like your child had access to like treatment and care? But even for yourself, like if you're going to be inserted into society anywhere, wouldn't you want to ensure that if you get like a cold or like pneumonia, you're not going to like die homeless on the streets? Like, don't you want to make sure? So I think it's kind of a ridiculous notion, but like there's also a broadly Rawlsian point to be made here about like put yourself in the shoes. Yeah.
The mentioning kids is an interesting point because, of course, I mean, we do have publicly funded schools, and I don't have kids. Like, I'm not, like I don't have any kids. Why should I have to pay for your kids, buddy?
Yeah.
Typically, I mean, even pretty right-wing people in the U.S. typically public schools, and they think that they're inefficient or whatever, but. They don't have this sort of in-principle objection. I think it's unfair to have free education for kindergartners and stuff, So the same sort of reasoning isn't really applied consistently, I don't think.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point too. Okay, we're almost done with the terrible objections. Thank God. We just have one more. This one will kind of bleed through into our next point. It's going to be very similar to a lot of the economic objections, but there's this kind of broad point. And again, so I want to stress again for people who are listening, or if I haven't stressed this enough, objections like this are about like government efficiency. And so we're kind of like, a lot of these objections, we're playing like the devil's advocate of like assuming like a state ownership, like a public ownership system. But of course, an idealized government that's democratic, generally speaking. This obviously wouldn't work if the government itself was very centralized power, like very top-down power structure. So again, we're talking about like governments that are ideally democratic, but we're also just kind of assuming, as a reductio of these arguments being made, that we're talking about government control, whereas people who are more sympathetic to the libertarian socialist vein are actually skeptical of some of the government moves. So it's more so about like worker-owned cooperatives, maybe like syndicates, what have you, worker unions and ownership. I think this is like Chomsky's view broadly is like a syndicalist view on which there's like worker unions that own things. But so
he's a little, I think he's a little sketchy on the details, just sort of on the theory that, it's kind of hard to know in advance exactly how things are gonna play out, and you need some experimentation, which is kind of a reasonable view, right. I think.
Yeah, definitely. But all that to say, like the points about government control can all pretty much sort of be dismissed under a certain conception of socialism. Like the definitions of socialism we're working under can be applied to like a government or not. Again, we're kind of assuming the government for reductios. That's just a point to be made. Yeah. Because this next point people make very broadly, because they think of socialism as government controls, it's inefficient, right? Like government's not efficient. All their institutions are not effective. So like look at the DMV or the VA and how like they handle healthcare. So like the point, then they'll extrapolate. They'll be like, oh, well, the government doesn't handle this well. So you really want them in charge of your healthcare. So I think, and then there's also kind of the point along with this. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said like the problem with socialism is that it like just takes up too many evenings, right? Having all this like democratic bureaucracy of decision making is just not going to be able to produce, effectively produce anything. So I think as far as the inefficiency of government institutions, there's a couple points I like to make to this. For one, the same point Nathan Robinson makes in his video, Why Democratic Socialism is Good, is very simply that some government institutions are inefficient, sure, but some are very efficient, right? Like, and some of the ones that are efficient are so because of capital interests, like, I don't know, war. But then there's also some like public schools, which maybe the education system itself isn't ideal, but like the actual process is rather efficient and it manages things. So it's just simply not true.
Medicare, Medicare is a good example. Government-run program that people who are on Medicare are usually pretty happy with it.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just simply not true. This like blanket statement that like, oh, government's always bad at doing things, right? Like it's true that they are sometimes, but that's true of anything. So, and of course, like efficiency is not the only metric we want to look at. But as far as the takes up too many evenings, again, like democracy, I take to be intrinsically valuable. So to spend some more time to avoid like exploitation of people's rights, then that's fine. But is there anything else there you think? I mean, we kind of covered some of this already, but I mean, it's just sort of not, it's a non-starter because it's just like, this doesn't apply to everything, but.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, Germany, despite its reputation for efficiency, is also kind of notorious for government bureaucracy. So I do get the, I do get the I mean, having moved here and had to deal with some of the bureaucracies, I get the thought, right? But of course, it's true that I mean, government agencies vary wildly in how efficient they are and how much of a pain they are to deal with and that sort of stuff. And it's also true that I mean, the kind of market socialist model that I sketched a minute ago. Really, again, it's not like you would have central planners trying to make decisions, running everything through some large government bureaucracy or something like that. To a large extent, the market would be able to function just as it does right now. It's just that the surplus is not getting captured by a small group of people.
All right. Yeah, perfect. Okay, yeah, I think there's some good general stuff there. It's good to have the kind of Germany perspective too. It's good to be able to bring that in. So, all right.
Any time you move in Germany, you have to register your address with the government. You have to have a meeting and register your address with the government. And if you're in a small town, that's not so bad. But if you're in Munich, where the city bureau, I mean, there are 2 million people, and the city bureaucracy is very underfunded. You either have to go to the KVR, the citizen's office, at like 6 a.m. and line up and then try to run to like get a number, or else you have to make an online appointment. But the online appointment system, anytime you look, is just booked full for months. And so what you have to do is realize this is not public information, but realize that they post appointments at either 7 or 8 a.m. in the morning, whenever like the person starts a shift. It's different on different days, and sit there and just refresh the page until an appointment slot opens up. And then you can get an online appointment, and then you go in, and you still have to wait because they're always behind schedule. But eventually you can get an appointment and do your address registration. And you have to do this before you can do anything else, basically, to get a bank account or so. You have to have registered your address and shown the proof of this. So yeah, I mean, I definitely know the frustration of dealing with kind of absurd bureaucracies, but.
Yeah, so if anybody's tuning in from Germany, some good insider information there,
Yeah, well, the German, I mean, in Munich, everybody agrees with this judgment. It's not dealing with the KVR is the worst thing in the world.
It sounds very similar to here how the DMV works, or going to get like your driver's license done. It's a mess, but yeah, there's differences there, so that's good. All right, well. Thankfully, I think we're through kind of that first initial painful section of just kind of like objections that are non-starters. But I think they're worth addressing because, for one, they're common, and two, it's effective to kind of lay out more in-depth kind of the fundamental disagreements that capitalists and socialists have about things like social welfare. So we covered some of this, a good portion of the points I have here, which is good because I want to spend the most time on the libertarian arguments, like philosophy. But we will, to address some of the economic stuff again, I think we answered this one. Like, people will just say, like, well, collective ownership of means of production would just remove, like, the competition of market functions, right? And that, like, there's, like, this self-interest element to, like, market competition, kind of along with the risk. So there's a self-interest that goes along and helps, like, maintain and spur innovation, and this competitiveness, and a collective ownership would take that away. So like earlier we addressed that, like, oh, well, some socialist systems are compatible with markets. Well, someone's rejoinder to that might be, well, sure they are, but the markets are not going to be nearly as efficient because they're controlled more socially, and it's kind of the private ownership itself that works within the market system. Because I generally agree with you that, like, a lot of the objections to socialism or a lot of the points for capitalism are just pro-market. They're not even pro, like, actually capitalism or anything. But so this is one possible rejoinder you might hear, that, like, yeah, sure, I mean, you may say socialism is compatible with markets, but if you actually tried this, like, there would be no, like, reason for people to be competitive or innovate. So you would just have this stagnation and not as much market growth. So basically, again, kind of building more on the inefficiency point, like collective ownership and socialized workplaces, socialized control would just stagnate efficiency. We've addressed most of this, I think, but what I mean, more particularly to that.
Yeah, and I think this is a concern with certain forms of central planning, say.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, the sort of system I laid out would be one where there are still there is a capital market. You don't have to run everything through some central bureaucracy. There is a capital market. It's just that at least most of the capital is controlled via what are ultimately government-owned investors. But there are investors who can compete against each other. There are firms that are competing against each other. Firms that are really inefficient either will have to improve or go out of business and be purchased by other firms. So you can have all of the sort of competition, Darwinian, whatever that's supposed to be so good about capitalist markets. You can have here. You might think that there's some sort of worry about small entrepreneurs who might be very concerned about trying to build a business for themselves, that sort of stuff. My own inclination is to think that, it's fine, again, to have some, small firms that are privately owned, provided they are also, they're subject to the sort of workplace regulations that you'd want in other places, that sort of stuff. I think that's all fine. At some point, maybe if they got big enough, they would be bought out by the socially controlled investors or something like that. So, Yeah, I think, I mean, maybe there's some reason why any of this couldn't work, but at least I'm sympathetic to the thought that, yeah, all this nice economic efficiency stuff that you get with capitalist markets, in principle, you can get through socialist markets too. It's just, again, the surplus is going to the people instead of to a small group. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. Good stuff there. Mostly addressed it. And we'll come back around to some of that a little bit on the point about just like capitalism pulls people out of poverty.
Yeah.
But so I think, again, we kind of in one fell swoop address most of these worries because, again, another like super. Now, this is one that's very common, but people actually think is like really economically like sophisticated is this whole the calculation problem that comes from Mises and Hayek. Basically just says that like, planning of the economy leads to this like inefficiency. It doesn't function to allocate resources. Like a price system does function well to allocate resources. And then, so it's kind of like it's kind of the main driving force, or at least part of this just general argument that, markets allocate resources well, and the market competition in capitalism is the best means for allocating those resources to increase quality, decrease costs, things like that. And so we shouldn't like interfere with markets. So this is a point that kind of is generally made by people who are, again, more laissez-faire. And then the point about this that I actually find kind of interesting is some people who push the calculation problem. I've countered this before by saying, socialism doesn't intrinsically have anything to do with central planning, but they'll say that like the transition from capitalism to socialism is going to require there to be at least a stage or a phase of central planning. Like we can't go like, it would have to go from like capitalism to central planning of the government to like socialized. And I guess I just don't really see much of a reason to think that's true.
Why did I think that?
I don't know. Again, it beats me. It's an economic. They're just like again, it comes from more so economists and philosophers, people who just say like, oh, if you're going to socialize these things, there's going to have to be I guess that they would think along the lines of what you said earlier. They'll take that to mean like, oh, the government's going to have to buy up all this stuff, and then the government's going to have to plan it and mandate it and like. And then like redistribute it to set up this kind of ideal socialized system, you have to have central planning. But again, as the way we've defined socialism, that whole process would ideally be done in a very like democratic and publicly controlled fashion. So there's nothing there resembling.
Yeah. I mean, the social, again, the financial instruments to do all this already exist.
Right. Yeah.
You could, even if you wanted, leave the same people in charge of firms and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, I don't think that you'd need any kind of central planning really. I do think, I mean, yeah. So what is the there are multiple forms of the calculation problem. The traditional one is the way that you described it. Well, prices in a market reflect supply and demand. Right? The price, if it's going up, then demand outstrips supply. If it's going down, then supply outstrips demand. If it's stable, then you've reached an equilibrium. This is good because demand reflects, I mean, basically what this reflects is the marginal utility of producing more of this good, how it's going to satisfy people's preferences, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I mean, there are other forms of the calculation problem as well, which apply to sort of other stages of the economy. So, for instance, when it comes to capital allocation, we need to decide should we use a certain piece of capital, money, or a factory or whatever. Should we use it to produce more goods right now, or should we use it to produce more capital, build a new factory so that we can produce more stuff later? And if we should, then, well, what kind of factory are we going to build? Do we need more cars? Do we need more T-shirts? And so the thought there is that, well, you have all this information that's dispersed among different people, all these different investors, and all these investors, by using their own resources, can sort of make predictions about what demand is going to be like in the future. What are we going to need? The people who are good at this are going to be successful and make more money. The people who are bad at it will lose their money, so they're going to drop out of the market. And eventually, again, through this process of competition, You're going to have really efficient people who are really good at predicting what we're going to need, are going to be making these investment decisions. And similarly, firms that are not very efficient are going to go to business. Their capital will get seized by other firms that are more needed, blah, blah. Okay. But yeah, I mean, you can have all that within a system where the ultimately the profits are being reaped by the people. And there are other virtues to sort of decentralized decision making anyway, in general. I mean, if you're somebody who runs a business, like, you might know more about what your customers want or about what you think is going to happen in the near future than people in some, central planning agency who are setting production quotas or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, there are lots of reasons why, yeah, it probably is true that with regard to many things, at least, central planners are not going to be making very good decisions. Maybe with regard to certain staples or whatever they can play. But with regard to many things, central planners are going to be making maybe not very good decisions. But you just don't need to have central planners. So what is the upshot of that supposed to be?
Right. Yeah. And a lot of the objections from the the Austrian school to central planning is this kind of in principle objection to say Keynesianism, but of course the economic system of Keynes is specifically for recessions. So there may be instances in which more planning is needed for economies to recover. But
yeah, I mean, you definitely you need government interventions at the very least. Even if you're really a fan of markets, you should agree that you need government interventions to correct for certain sorts of market failures. Yeah. That's something, though, that really everybody agrees with, except people who are kind of often crazy town.
Except the extremist right-wing libertarians, which are
yeah. So I mean, that's something that even capitalists ought to be able
right
with, if they're kind of being, if they're well informed and honest and so on.
Yeah, and I think this is the point I pointed this out to in my video on the ethics problems raised by coronavirus. And this is one thing, market failures and things. So kind of, I guess, again, so that's all good. But that kind of broad response takes out a lot of these central planning objections. But this is one, and a lot of these are really just, it's kind of annoying because a lot of these are reformulations of the same exact point. But it's you have to explicitly address them because I know if I don't, they're going to be oh, what about Michael Humer's Facebook post? And because Mike is, again, you talked about this a little bit, but Humer had this Facebook post the other day called Why We Need Capitalists. And his argument basically was something along the lines of in order to have economic production and wealth, you need people in the system who are willing and able to take risks. So you need capitalists. You need people who can privately, and then he basically argued that this is more efficient. It's more efficiently done to have these risks taken by capitalists and I think we've already given good reasons to think that none of that's really true. So it's good. I just want to say it so people can't say that we didn't address it. But obviously, with all the points he's making there about needing capitalists, we've already gone through. And then so the last thing really on the economic point, I think, is well, I mean, this is an argument I didn't really write down because we don't need to address it. It's sort of ridiculous. It's kind of just the conservative, the neoliberal, Reaganite and Thatcher birthed notion of we talked about a little bit, the individualism, the bootstraps. If you're in a bad place economically, it's your fault. And these things are just, they're not really worth taking seriously. I mean, again, it's only something that libertarians will believe. But if you look up any studies by sociologists or economists, you can find a million articles being if you're born into poverty, you got to get lucky for 20 years to get out of it. It's just a non-starter. So the pull it up by your bootstraps point is just pretty dumb. Then the last thing is about, this will get us a little more into, I think we alluded to some more theories of value and stuff, and socialism doesn't require it, but one thing that people say is that workers don't generate value. So this kind of whole notion of them being exploited or their value being taken advantage of is a false notion because workers don't generate the actual value, entrepreneurs do, and this is because value is not something that's just determined by labor, it's determined by supply and demand, so it's all subjective. So this is the point that kind of goes along with the necessity of capitalists. But I think there's this general point, workers don't even generate wealth. And I think that, again, this is one of those that's like there's some pretty clear historical counterexamples, like coronavirus right now being one of them. To keep the economy going, the CEOs are able to take the days off, but the grocery store workers who are making $10 an hour can't take the day off because they're the ones that keep the whole thing running. So I mean, the left, we've known this for a while, that like economies are built on the backs of labor, right? But there's kind of this general point, yeah.
I think you have to distinguish between the Marxist labor theory of value, which is that the value of something is determined by the amount of labor that goes into it. And again, the typical, I mean, the economic consensus is, no, that's wrong. It's determined by, these facts about marginal utility, which are reflected by, prices as set by supply and demand. You have to distinguish between that, the thought that labor sort of is the sole determinant of value or something like that, and the claim that labor is what produces these things that have value, whatever determines the exchange value of them, right? And yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious. I mean, why is the economy doing so bad right now? It's because people can't go into work, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what happens if the non-essential workers all quit right now? Well, it would be literally the end of civilization. So now, on the other hand, do entrepreneurs create value? Well, sure, they do. And you do. I mean, you want to leave room for innovation and rewarding people who are innovative and that sort of stuff. Though, again, it is important to keep in mind that large amounts of investment decisions are made by managers who are working for big funds that may very well would just be, using capital from somebody who's never done anything productive in their entire life, other than put their money into this fund, which in the aggregate is virtually guaranteed to produce very great profits for them in the long run. So, I mean, yeah, you can. It's true that labor is not. It's not the labor theory of value might be false, and it's true that entrepreneurs can produce things that are, but it doesn't follow from that you should have some sort of right libertarianism or something like that.
Yeah. I forget if I was going to say anything else there, but that's all good, generally speaking. I mean, I think labor theories of value it has varying levels. I think they're often dismissed too quickly by the right, but I don't think we to build our case on them as a necessary principle or anything.
There are people who try to defend versions of it still. But yeah, I mean, my view is that you don't really need. I mean, you don't need it for the sort of a non-Marxist version of the theory of exploitation. You don't need it to see that there's something unfair about many of these arrangements.
Right.
And Marxists relied on it. One of plenty of mistakes that Marx made. And yeah, I mean, you don't need it. You don't need it to see that workers are obviously producing value. I mean, what else are they getting paid for? It's not out of the goodness of the hearts of the people who are in the firms.
So it's kind of like a false dichotomy to say that's one or the other. There's kind of a more complex, there's a nuance there. Okay, so just two more points on the economics. So I can try to get through quickly because I really want to talk about Nozick. But so the first, and then the second point of these will actually kind of just bridge us into the kind of libertarian philosophical arguments. But we're doing okay on time. I mean, if we do these 2 points in the next 12 minutes, we have a solid half hour to do the others, assuming that's cool with you. So we should be fine. But so there's another argument that capitalists make, or again, free market people, is just that this government institution would itself create a monopoly, which that's not okay. We've already discounted that because we talked about democracy and public ownership. But then there's the argument that the monopolies that do form, that socialists like us have problems with, these monopolies only form because of government intervention and government regulations, right? If the free market were left to itself, it would actually weed out. I mean, this is one of the worst thinkers ever. Ayn Rand makes this point, but there are generally intelligent people that make it as well. But I think Ayn Rand said something like, in a free market, like people, the general idea is like that, free market, you vote with the dollar. So like you would never let things get to monopoly levels. And this is another one where like a lot of these points, like there's just clear empirical refutations of this. And this is where I'd plug my book recommendation of Rob Larson's Capitalism versus Freedom, because he goes through like a lot of the historical counterexamples to this. Like, for example, in Mexico, like the television industry was pretty diverse. And once they removed regulations, now one guy owns like 90% of the industry. So any kind of like political advertising, radio advertising is all controlled by essentially one guy. So there are, and that's just one of many clear counterexamples in terms of like, but it seems very obvious from an armchair level of like, yeah, if you don't have regulations, people are going to be able to monopolize more. If they don't, as you said earlier, like if Bezos doesn't have a limit on how much he can accumulate, then there's not going to, it's just going to be. So I think it's worth, though, at least looking at this point briefly, monopolies are always the result of government, which is just not true. But
I mean, and I guess in some sense that's true. I mean, if the government didn't enforce property rights at all, then I guess nobody would own anything, and so you wouldn't need to worry about monopolies. If there was no copyright law, then a drug company wouldn't have a monopoly on a certain treatment, but I mean, few people want to get rid of copyright law. I think that, I mean, one thing to do is just to look at what happened back in the U.S. when there was much less regulation at the turn of the century. And while this was when monopolies were at their height, right? Either monopolies or oligopolies, which are about as bad because they can engage in price fixing and stuff absent government regulation. I guess more generally, whether you should expect a free market to produce a monopoly will depend on, for instance, how easy it is for new producers to break into the market. If it's something that is, it's easy for me to just start my own firm and enter in, well, then of course, if one firm is charging too much, there will be competition, and so. But if it's a situation where, say, it's very capital intensive, so it's going to be hard for new producers to break in. If your monopoly depends upon some sort of technology that you've copyrighted so that other people can't. There are other situations where, if it depends upon a certain resource that is not available to other people, maybe if I have cornered the market on a certain resource and I'm just not going to sell it to people who are going to compete with me. There are other situations where you should expect unregulated markets to produce either monopolies or oligopolies of some sort. As you let the unregulated market run and capital becomes more and more concentrated, you should expect this to do it more and more because there will be less capital available for potential competitors and that sort of stuff. I think it just depends. Really, ultimately, what these show is more that you do need certain sorts of regulations on the market, at least in certain industries, given certain conditions.
Right. Yeah, because people just tend to assume like regulations choke out small business, so it's actually the government intervention that is problematic for creating monopolies. Which, of course, there's again counterexamples and all the points you've raised, but there could be a whole video probably on that point, just going through some of that. But again, Larson's book, and then if anybody is interested, Rob Larson has a interview on YouTube. You can just watch like an hour and a half long with Current Affairs called like Big Tech and the Problem with Monopoly Power. And he talks about some of the specific issues with like the information age and like, Amazon, Google, and some of the particular technological monopolies. So that's worth looking at. Okay, so that's all great. I'm glad we got some of the economic points out of the way. I mean, the general takeaway is a lot of them are non-starters because socialists aren't ideologically committed to any kind of central planning. So any objection to central planning isn't really an objection to socialism. So the last point that we're doing here, we'll kind of use this to bridge into the last major section on libertarian arguments, and this is kind of an economic point, but a lot of libertarians use it. And so again, this is one where people like think they're coming from the right place when they say this, and it's basically the point that just like, well, capitalism as an economic system has done more to lift people out of poverty and reduce poverty and like increase standards of living than any other system. Like it's not socialism that's pulled people in like China, Japan, or wherever out of these terrible conditions. It's been capitalism. And so they'll say like, well, on average now, like people's living conditions are better than like even royalty in like the feudal era. And, poverty's reduced exponentially. And this is all because of capitalism, because even though there's like this wealth concentration, it lifts people up. The free market still lifts people out of poverty. And there are a couple things to say here. I mean, there's another, I reference Current Affairs a lot, but their article, 5 Myths About Global Poverty, they go through some of why this is a little bit misleading. There's also the very basic argument that like Nathan Robinson makes that like just because something's been effective in the past, like we're looking at right now is how the world is and how we can make it better. So even if capitalism's done all this great stuff, that doesn't mean we have to stick with it. If we can now transition things to a state of affairs that's better, we should. So this isn't any like reason necessarily to stay with capitalism perpetually. And then the other point, what did I have for this? Is just that I think often people there's a misleading notion here, and it's that a lot of this production efficiency is sort of correlated with like the rise of industrial era. So I'm kind of skeptical about how much of this production is actually due to capitalism, how much of it is due to the fact that we just have industrialization, right? So like it's just there's way more efficient. So there's nothing necessarily saying that it was capitalism and no other system could have done it. I mean, if you gave a socialist economy the factories, then why couldn't they have done the same thing? But I don't have hard data on that point. That's just a speculation of mine. But those are kind of my general thoughts on that. I mean, there's no reason to assume that this is any reason to prefer capitalism perpetually, and the criticisms still apply, right? So we could, and there's almost like a Marxist argument there of like, yeah, we needed that to happen. We needed this accumulation of vast wealth, and now we can redistribute it. But so there's a couple of my general thoughts. Did you have anything else there that's relevant?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, it's, I guess for one thing, it's worth pointing out there have been times where where liberalization has produced very bad results, again, like in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And there have been times when non-capitalist systems have produced very impressive results. So maybe the largest and most sustained increase in life expectancy, probably in human history, was under Mao in China, which is impressive when you consider that he was killing all these people at the same time. But it was because of better healthcare in rural areas and education and whatever. Which of course is not a vindication of Mao, but is just to say,
right.
Well, the government-run aspects of that system, insofar as they pertain to healthcare and education, actually did a lot of good in certain contexts. Yeah, I mean, so it's it's more broadly, it is true that capitalist systems have produced lots of wealth. Generally, they did produce a lot more wealth than centrally planned economies in the 20th century, which, okay, I mean, we're not defending centrally planned economies, so fair enough, but and the question is, do we have ways to, harness the productive power of these markets while avoiding some of the problems that capitalist systems have shown? So I don't deny, in general, I don't deny the point. Yeah, they have produced lots of wealth, but they also have produced certain serious problems. Can we have one without the other? So.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a general point. It's like, well, okay, people raise that argument, so you're like, all right, fine, but like, there's still a lot of things we need to deal with. The argument being made is about here and now. We need kind of a change in institutions. Okay, awesome. So that brings us to the exciting point, the one I'm excited for the most, the Libertarian Arguments. So, and I believe these, and there's some like, actually, this is good because this is actually like, these are arguments that are generally pretty philosophically sophisticated, and they're actually targeting socialism, at least part of the time. I mean, Nozick still falls into the thing of like, sometimes it's attacking central planning, but generally speaking, or just redistribution, but generally speaking, these are actually like good arguments. So I'm pretty excited. So I think the way I plan to do this is I'll really quickly just kind of run through the overview of kind of like Nozick's, as at far as I understand it. But you'll probably be able to fill in some gaps afterwards because you'll be a little more familiar. But because it's kind of like his whole arguments are kind of like tied to this sort of complex like narrative about property rights. So it's like the arguments can't be taken like step by step. It's part of this whole framework, right? So Nozick, I'll go into, and then there's a couple points that we'll make that are not necessarily Nozick's. Because eventually, his point boils down to something like socialism denies like individual rights or doesn't sufficiently protect them. It's problematic for individual rights, and it's it exists. But there's stuff prior to justifying that. So, and this gets into a lot of like the common, the contemporary objections from libertarians, right? Things with non-aggression, taxation. So we covered this a little bit, so I'll just go over it generally, and then you can fill in and we can go through the points. But so we talked about this, alluded to this earlier, like this kind of Lockean story of property entitlement. So the just acquisition of property, and so therefore the kind of like just way justice should be distributed, generally speaking, is explained by this notion of like self-ownership that Nozick draws. It's like, well, you own yourself completely, and this is kind of like an attractive notion because it denies people the right to to interfere with you and your rights in any way. They're kind of like radically independent. It also like provides, and one objection to self-ownership that is not very good is like, oh, well, it entitles that you can own a person, and so it could lead to like slavery. But the self-ownership argument Nozick draws actually like rules out slavery by definition, because it says, well, because you own yourself, no one has the right to own you. So his system is built on this kind of like idea of owning oneself. And then he extrapolates from this ideas about like property entitlement. So we'll talk about the notion of self-ownership. But also there's
he does actually think that you could voluntarily consent to slavery.
Right. Yeah, that's true. So we'll
permanently sell your labor, I guess.
That's true. Yeah, I should have written that down, because I was reading it from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I was kind of reading over the section on Nozick, and they were like, yeah, self-ownership is attractive because it actually rules out slavery. And I was like, I'm pretty sure Nozick is cool with voluntary slavery. But yeah, so we'll cover that when we talk about self-ownership.
You can say sell your kid into slavery.
Right, yeah, you can only sell yourself. Yeah, okay. So there's some interesting points to cover there too. But then, so that kind of notion, that bleeds into like his general Lockean story about private property rights, which is what we talked about a little bit earlier, which, property is kind of justly acquired as this result of mixing labor with natural resources. Because this is another thing that socialists and capitalists generally differ on, because we do have this question of like, well, at one point there are things that are unowned because humans haven't been here forever, and now we have people own things. So how does that happen? Is it just? So Nozick endorses, he thinks it follows from self-ownership that, you can have private property justly acquired by mixing your labor with natural resources. And then, so given that is where he gets his view, the taxation is theft, and even in some cases, forced slavery. So we'll talk about the taxation as theft point, because a lot of the way it's normally put is very, very unspecific. People will just say it, and it's like, what do you mean by theft? If you mean stealing, then like fine, because I'm okay with stealing in some ethical cases. There's no problem there. If you're just defining theft as wrong in virtue of its definition, then you're just begging the question, so it doesn't really matter. This is Ben Burgess's point, but Nozick actually gives like a somewhat sophisticated, at least, account of why he thinks that, and this is that given his view on private property, following from self-ownership, he argues that like taxation or any form of like wealth redistribution is morally illegitimate, because anytime like you're working, part of the time you're working produces money that's being taxed and essentially taken from you. So you're essentially working for the state or whatever redistributive bodies in place involuntarily. And so in that sense, it's forced labor and even slavery. Of course, as Nathan Robinson points out in his article about this, it's kind of ridiculous to compare this to slavery. Anybody who actually lived in like a slave state would just laugh at this. But the general point Nozick's making about forced labor is worth considering. And then, so along with that, there's kind of the whole libertarian conception of like the non-aggression principle and violence. And this is where the taxation theft thing comes from. And general objections to socialism is that it violates the non-aggression principle, which in its weakest form, the non-aggression principle just says something like you shouldn't like attack people for no reason. And as though it kind of like plays itself as this sort of just very general pacifism, which not really much follows from. But once you pull more out of it, it gets to this sense of like, really aggression against like property is also illegitimate. So on the libertarian view, this includes yourself because of the ownership of oneself, but also against your property. And I really like Jeff McMahon's kind of treatment. I think Jeff McMahon's treatment of just war theory is rather applicable to this, or his notion of like retaliatory war in defense, basically saying that like, you know, it's not justified to like kill people in defense of like maybe some like state assets or like property. And I think his notion there is rather applicable to this, right? It's obviously not justifiable to kill people for like infringements on property rights. If they're stealing your TV, you can't like shoot them. But again, libertarians tend to disagree with that, at least the more extreme ones. So that's the very general cases, this non-aggression principle, which we can pull apart more. But so the main points are like the point about self-ownership, and then this kind of like Lockean story about private property and rights, and then the non-aggression principle, taxation being illegitimate. And of course, taxation being illegitimate would kind of be a problem for socialism as we've drawn it out, or a problem for wealth redistribution, which is kind of essential to at least getting towards a socialist idea. So we'll just, and then there's like the, you know, voluntarism. So they get from all this that like only legitimate actions are voluntary, which is where they get the thing like, you know, wage, like as you talked about earlier, like wage slavery. Like, well, it's not slavery because they consent to it, which it's like not really. But so those are like the main points. So yeah, I've been talking for a while now. Hopefully that all made sense. But if you want to fill in any gaps on my understanding of Nozick, but
there are a couple of things going on, I guess. So there's the, I mean, first of all, there's the stuff with the non-aggression principle, which Nozick does not rely on. And in general, political philosophers and ethicists don't really take forms of libertarianism based on the non-aggression principle very seriously. And I mean, I guess there are sort of two big worries with it. I mean, you might think initially it kind of, you know, I mean, it sort of seems right. Oh, yeah, don't aggress against people. One is that as you noted, in order to get the implications that libertarians want, we have to build a pretty robust understanding of what aggression is, right? Well, I can't. I mean, can I just go and like sit on your lawn? Well, I guess not. So it's you can't initiate violence against me by getting me off your lawn. So it must be that I've initiated violence against you by sitting on your lawn. So okay, so that's aggression, sitting on your lawn without your permission. Okay, so aggression really means all this stuff about property. You know, I can't defraud you. That's aggression. I can't sit on your lawn. So really, we're presupposing a theory of property rights about what you're allowed to do, that you have a right to keep all your stuff without being taxed. And once we realize all the stuff that's built into don't aggress against people, well, maybe it's not quite as obvious that, you know, it seemed like just as good. Yeah, don't like walk up and kill people. I mean, that seems right. Yeah. So we have to build all this stuff into it. And also, once we do build all this stuff into it, it has implications that are absolutely insane. I mean, so Murray Rothbard, who's one of the primary proponents of it, thinks it's okay for you to starve your kid, because that's not like you know, you don't have to give your kid food. You can't stop your kid from going out and getting food. You know, your toddler, if they can go find some food, you can't stop them, but you don't have to give them food. So yeah, you know, that it would be aggression to force you to use your properties to sustain this other. I mean, sure, the kid is in need, but lots of people are in need. You don't have to help people just because they need help. I mean, that's absurd. So yeah, if you're here in your house, you've got the door open. If the kid wants to go out and go to the supermarket, they can get some, you know, you're not stopping them. I want to go to your house and give the kid some food. Well, now I'm in the wrong because you didn't consent to my coming onto your lawn to give the kid some food. I've aggressed against you. Now you can take action against me because I'm trying to feed this kid. I mean, this is absolutely crazy, right? So once you start thinking about what the non-aggression principle, taken as an absolute principle, as Rothbard and other people want it to be. Once you start thinking about what it really means, or I mean, there are, and notoriously, it has difficulty justifying how any sort of industrial civilization, in fact, any sort of post discovery of fire civilization could exist, because of course it can't be. I can't say shoot a gun right over your head, right, with some significant chance of hitting. That's imposing a risk on you. So imposing a risk on you must be aggression. Well, what if I start a fire? Well, a fire creates pollution. It releases carcinogens. You might breathe that in. It could give you cancer. You didn't consent to me starting a fire. So it looks like anything that creates any kind of pollution, which virtually anything that you do in an industrial society does in some way. Well, that's imposing a risk on you without your consent. Is that aggression? Like, well, if it is, then I guess we all, goodbye to all of this, Yeah, I mean, the NAP is nuts. You can try to modify it to make it less nuts, but then it's going to be less clear that it really gives you these kinds of right libertarian results that you want. Now, when it comes to Nozick is more serious than these NAP people. When it comes to Nozick, I mean, there's sort of something. I mean, this is actually G.A. Cohen has a book about this where he argues, well, there's kind of something to the Nozick style self-ownership, forced labor point, because really, what he's thinking about the government is quite similar to what socialists have often said about capitalists. I'm here, I'm a worker, I'm doing all the work, all this surplus labor is getting extracted. I have to sell my labor to this guy to survive. Isn't this essentially making, forced labor? All of the profit is stuff that should have gone to me, and it's getting taken by this other guy. So I mean, there's something that is you can sort of sympathize, not only sympathize with the thought, but it's not so different from what some socialists have said. But I mean, does it really get us the results that Nozick wants? Well, of course, to really get the view that taxation is theft, you have to, if it's theft in some moralized sense, it's wrongful theft. You have to think, I have a right to all this stuff, not just to the post-tax share, but I have a right to all of it. I have a right against being taxed to do these other socially valuable things. And I have a right against that which outweighs any reason that you might have for taxing me. Okay. Now, is that true? Well, Nozick's argument for this is something like this. If you have just original acquisition, and what does that mean? It means something like the Lockean, we go out and find unowned things and mix our labor with them, leaving as much as good for others, and then I come to own it. That's nice. And you have just transfer. What is just transfer? Well, just you agreed to give it to somebody else or to sell it to somebody else. Everybody lived up to their end of the bargain. If you have a just original state, just original acquisition, and then you have just transfers, whatever results at the end is going to be just. And he tells famously this nice little story about Wilt Chamberlain. We start out with whatever distribution of wealth you think is just. Maybe everybody has the same amount. Maybe it's in accordance with the Rawlsian difference principle, whatever. Wilt Chamberlain says, hey, everybody, I'm going to go do my basketball stuff. You can pay me $1 and you can watch me play basketball. Everybody thinks, oh, that's a great deal. So they all go in, they drop the dollar in the box. Wilt Chamberlain takes the money home. And after a couple of years of this, Wilt Chamberlain now has way more money than everybody else. Was that unjust? And Nozick thinks, no, we started out by agreement with a just distribution. We had just transfers. We wound up with a just distribution at the end. And so, in fact, any pattern of wealth distribution could, in principle, be a just one. And in fact, it would be wrong for the state to interfere with it, provided it came about in the right way, provided the history is correct. Now, two worries about this. One is, well, how much of the stuff that anybody actually owns did they come to own like that? Now, I mean, right? Like, you can see the problem. Nobody who lives in America except for a small number of Native Americans maybe, came to own anything through a process that looks anything like that, right? So, in fact, historically, all of this stuff all of these transfers were rife with injustice. So, it's very far from clear that you can justify any actually existing property regime through this. And Nozick doesn't talk about this as much as you might would think. He does recognize this, and he says, okay, we might need some kind of like one-time corrective before we embark on this libertarian society. So one thing you might just say is, all right, but once you start agreeing to the one-time corrective, I'll take you seriously that this is all right. But second of all, I mean, do we really believe? And in isolation, okay, everybody gave Wilt Chamberlain $1. The story taken in isolation seems all right. But do we really believe that any resulting pattern of wealth distribution has to be just as long as it's done through voluntary consent? I mean, suppose it happens that Wilt Chamberlain, he's also a canny investor and he starts buying capital. And of course, he can pass it on to his kids. That's just because he voluntarily passes it on to his kids. And his kids are canny investors too. Suppose we wind up with a situation where Wilt Chamberlain's family, after a couple generations, just owns everything. And I'm born, I didn't have anything to do with this. They own everything. I have no way to survive except to, become a serf for them. And I'm voluntarily going to become a serf. I mean, I would starve to death otherwise, but I could have just starved.
Voluntary.
Right?
The choice.
Well, I mean, it looks like this is just, and it would in fact be wrong for the government to do anything to break this stranglehold that Wilt Chamberlain's kids have over all of the resources in society and to help all of these poor serfs, because it came about through people voluntarily exchange, and that, I think, shows us something has gone wrong here with this theory of property rights. Yeah, it is often the case that the fact that somebody, voluntarily trading something to somebody else, that makes the resulting distribution just. That's fine. But turning this into a general exceptionless theory that's supposed to show that all taxation is wrong, you can never have economic redistribution against the will of the rich people involved, this sort of stuff. I mean, that's really, you've kind of gone off the cliff at that point, I think.
Wow, yeah, that's all great. Thank you. That's why I was super excited for this part. Because there's also some, I remember there was a couple current affairs articles that were relevant to this. One of them was like taxation is neither theft nor slavery, but like property is. It's kind of like this traditional leftist argument starting with Pruden that like, property is theft actually. And we don't go all into that. At this point, we're just kind of debunking some bad arguments, but you touched on some of it there. Like the history of how property's actually been acquired has largely been just through like genocide and force, right? So like, it's actually very counterintuitive to the libertarian idea of aggression. Most property, like the entire United States, we only own as a nation because of like just mass violence, right? And that's basically how almost all like property claims have come about. And there was there's some more extrapolation on that point in the article, but the thought experiment you raised about Wilt Chamberlain is really good. And it's similar to another current affairs article called like Thought Experiments for Libertarians. And there's one about like, say you bump into a guy, like you're just walking down the street or something and you like bump into him and like accidentally spill coffee on him. And you're like, oh, sorry, it's an accident, but the guy like hates you now and you didn't know he's like some like hyper-capitalist wealthy guy. So he just goes through and he like buys up stock at your job and like gets you fired, but only through like the methods of like cutting like corporate expenses. Like he doesn't actually aggress upon you. He's just like, running a business efficiently. And then, you have this like great lakeside property. He buys up all the property around your house. He can't buy yours. He buys up all the property around it and like develops it into like a landfill and like ruins your view. So like, it's like this whole, like all this stuff happens. And at the end we have a situation that's just like terrible. And it's like, well, at what point in this story were this guy's like rights violated, or like at what point was private property unjustly? Like there's nothing on the libertarian analysis that was done wrong in this sense. Like at no point was this guy aggressed upon, like his property and himself. He wasn't like attacked directly, but he ends up like starving to death. And that was the other thing too. They said like, you buy up, like he hikes the prices of food all around the area, like healthcare. this guy ends up dying of like starvation and like surrounded by a landfill. It's like, but at no point on the libertarian analysis were his rights actually aggressed upon. It's like, what's wrong there? So similar to the Will Chamberlain point, there's like,
when these people and folks are preaching freedom, independence, blah blah blah. Once you've got to the part in the story where you've had to sell yourself into serfdom, or where you have to live in terror of these capitalists who can ruin you through perfectly legal means, if you, it's like, well, I mean, how free are we really? Right? How independent are we really?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, so that's all some good stuff. And I think also like we didn't even, your case actually, the most of the arguments I've heard countering this, or at least what I've read so far, most people are just like, well, the lock-in account of private property is just nuts. Like, like this doesn't even make any sense. It's more so just like assertions and actual argument. It's like, okay, I own myself, so I just mix my labor with resources, and now I own stuff, and somehow that translates to like people being able to own factories. I mean, there's so many leaps there. It's more so just like assertions than arguments, but I think we don't even have to like argue straightforwardly against that, given the points you raise. Just like really two more things on this point. For one, given we've already addressed this really, but Nozick's arguments based on individual rights, he basically says like, well, given people's rights, they can't be forced to serve others or serve the good of like society. They can't be forced to do this. They have to. And this a lot of times in like, that's like Nozick's argument, which is like makes sense on his theory at least. But then the more popular level of this argument is people will just say like, you have negative rights but not positive rights. Like the only rights you have are just like not to be attacked, but you don't have any right to demand anything of other people. And to me, that just seems self-defeating, right? Like negative rights just to me sort of entail positive ones. Like if I have the negative right not to be killed, then I have the right to demand people not kill me. Like this just kind of simply follows from negative rights.
I suppose it's supposed to be a positive right is a right to have somebody else do something, whereas a negative right is a right against them doing something.
What do you think generally though about that?
Not doing something.
But like, what do you think? I mean, because generally Nozick, I mean, we've already talked about like this coercion and non-aggression principle.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Nozick's claim there again is resting on his theory of property rights, where you have a right to these things and we're kind of taking it from you and forcing you as a condition. Again, we don't accept this Lockean theory, then that's not even going to get off the ground. I think the more general theory of negative, people only have negative rights. That just seems, again, it's vulnerable to the same sorts of counterexamples. I guess I'm not any, if I just have the negative rights that libertarians think I have, I'm not having any of my negative rights violated when I'm forced to choose between serfdom to Will Chamberlain's children or starvation. But clearly, I'm not being treated justly in this situation.
Yeah, you're not free in any meaningful sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm bleeding to death, and you drive by in your car, and I ask for a ride to the hospital, and you don't want to get your seats messy, so you just drive on past. You haven't violated any negative rights that I have, but clearly it would be, that would be wrong. It seems reasonable to think even if somebody else had a gun, that they could forcibly commandeer your car in that situation, given that I'm going to die otherwise. There's this famous example from Joel Feinberg where I'm lost. I'm a hiker. I'm lost in a blizzard. I'm about to freeze to death, and I find your abandoned cabin. Can I break into your cabin in order to find shelter and save my life? Well, obviously I can, but it's not. I actually am infringing on your property right in that sense. I might owe you some compensation for the window I broke or whatever afterwards. But obviously, doing what I need to do to save my life or to save somebody else's life is permissible. It would be wrong for you to try to stop me from getting in the cabin.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Dustin, you're violating the non-aggression principle by bleeding on that guy's seats. You're violating his property. Yeah, getting blood on his seats. That's awesome. Yeah, so there's always going to be like reformulations of that, but it's generally some good points against this So we're the last point we have on the libertarian arguments. We're doing decent on time, actually, but I'm glad we got through all that. So just the general points, but the last thing comes from, we talked about this a little bit before recording, but Jason Brennan, his book, Why Not Capitalism, which is a response to G.A. Cohen's Why Not Socialism. For one thing, he argues that Cohen compares, ideal socialism to like the worst version of capitalism, which that's not really relevant to what we're talking about. I've heard from some people who've read it that's not true, but I've not read both, so I'll just leave that for another time. But basically, another thrust to the argument he gives that a lot of people take to be like really effective is he says that if we're just going to compare ideal societies, which seems fair, an ideal capitalist society, like laissez-faire, these just property transactions, ideally this capitalist society allows for socialist institutions and for socialist methods of control. But the reverse isn't true. Like an ideal socialist society kind of denies these like claims about property rights. So it denies this kind of like capital ownership. So the basic argument he gives boils down to like ideal capitalist societies allow for the voluntary, attainment of like the best of socialist societies. So it's like the best of both worlds because there's the freedom to do both. But socialist societies are more narrow and they don't allow for capitalist institutions. So we should prefer the capitalist ones because in the ideal, and in his argument again about ideals, so even if this isn't true in the here and now, he's just saying, well, ideally a proper capitalist system would allow for all of this. And I've heard this argument too, again, from more lay people. They're like, well, if we had a complete like, it was more extremist, especially like anarchist, like capitalists, or like we said, like stateless capitalism. Like, you can voluntarily do whatever you want. So you can start a commune. You could be communists over in like Iowa. Entire Iowa could be like a communist commune, but then we could have private. So we could just have this diverse portfolio of economic institutions, and that's more desirable than having just like socialism. So there's some empirical reasons why to doubt this, but what do you think of that, generally, as we round off here?
Yeah. So this is, I haven't read Brennan, but this is quite similar to a different argument that Nozick gives, which he thinks is like an independent argument for his libertarian state. And I think it's a shame, honestly, that it gets so much less attention than the other arguments which come earlier in the book, because I think it's in a lot of ways more interesting than the sort of crazier arguments that rely on these libertarian moral principles. Nozick's thought is, you'll look in my society, you can form, if you want to have a socialist community and everybody agrees to give up their property rights to whatever, to capital, whatever, you can do that. If you want to have a Catholic theocracy and everybody agrees that they'll be punished if they use birth control or something, then you can do that. And as long as people have exit rights, they can move back and forth between these different communities, and we'll all be able to see which one works best. And the ones that are better at promoting flourishing will get more members, and we'll be able to, through these experiments in living, everybody will be able to observe what sort of community they want to live in, and so won't this just all be great? Now, I think, I haven't been appealing to ideal theory so far, right? I'm in general not super interested in the ideal theory in the sense that Brennan needs it. Assuming everything works perfectly the way you want it to and so on. So I think that kind of an ordinary, if we're thinking about how are these things going to work in practice, sort of an ordinary person coming upon this argument. This is the reason I say it's interesting, because you think like, it kind of makes some intuitive sense. At the same time, you think like, is that really how it's going to work? Aren't there going to be, what if like some communities, the people who own the most capital all move to those, and we just wind up, other people have to go work for them in order to survive. And, it seems like we might just wind up, and it reiterates, everybody is forced now, practically speaking, to be in a capitalist system, but it's just one without any labor protections or a welfare state or anything like that, because the government's no longer stepping in. The people in capital can sort of set the term. If something like that happens, then, well, our utopia doesn't really seem all that utopian anymore. But I also, you kind of have to ask, I mean, what would be, again, if this is being put forward as a not just as an experiment in ideal theory, but as a serious proposal, this is something we could really do. I mean, you have to ask what the transitional theory is, right? I've said I think there is, a way you could transition to the sort of market socialism that I've been talking about, namely just through these pre-existing financial instruments that the government can just buy. Yeah. How are we going to transition to this ideal, the framework for utopia that we're talking about here? Well, I mean, you could just implement a libertarian state and have everybody own what they own right now, and we all just begin living in this way. And then you would have exactly what I just said, right? You have all these people who own the capital, and they just no longer have any laws keeping them in check, apart from the fact that they can't murder people and so on. And so now they can set whatever terms of employment they want for unskilled workers, and they're going to be able to accumulate as much as they can. So that looks like it's just going to be a disaster. You really couldn't set up your nice little socialist commune there, because, I mean, you do need some capital in order to survive. On the other hand, I mean, are we going to have year zero? Are we going to redistribute everything, just the one time, have the big correction, and then we embark on the, yeah, I mean, again, the people don't like that idea, right? The year zero, break up everything, start society over again. So that, I mean, that's not really anything anybody wants. That's not, I mean, you can imagine the amount of violent resistance that you would encounter if you really tried to do that. You can imagine the huge social and economic disruptions. So I think you kind of, practically speaking, you have to ask, what is the transitional theory here? If we do it while kind of leaving things to some extent in place, then you just have, it seems very likely that this system just results in kind of the worst sort of capitalism you can have, just total robber baron, Gilded Age, whatever. On the other hand, if we try to start from year zero, I mean, that's not, that's going to be awful costly. The people who are endorsing this sort of libertarianism don't really want to do that. So even if it would work under ideal conditions, exactly the way that Nozick thinks, how are we going to get there? And unless you can have some sort of roadmap for getting there that isn't just going to make it fail horribly and isn't going to have unacceptable consequences, it doesn't really, practically speaking, matter very much,
All right. Yeah, that's awesome. And then it raises the question too of, like, if you're in principle okay with like a massive reset button like that, like, well, if things go wrong, are you cool with that again? Like, do we just have like an unlimited use on like just social? Because in that case, it's like that.
Yeah,
like you're just fine with
how many year zeros are we gonna have?
Yeah, right. Something goes wrong. How many times are we able to fix it? So then it's like, well, then you're just fine with wealth redistribution at a level. It's like, okay, great. Now we're sort of on the same page. But yeah. No, that's great. Okay, well, I think that was about all the main points covered. We're a little over 2 hours here, so I don't want to keep you for really any longer. But great points covered. General gist of everything is, socialism isn't equal to central planning. I think we've given some generally good, like, again, there's always more to read, but the general case for why socialism is prima facie and, morally preferable to capitalism, I think, is a pretty good one. I thought that already. I'm a little bit biased, but this conversation just reinforced that, because it's good to have really, like, sophisticated objections to things like, libertarian theories of property rights, because it's complex and it's often oversimplified in just the spectrum of discussion. So, Dustin, thank you once again so much for coming on again. Everybody check out Dustin's website. I'll try to link it in the description and all his work, which is great. If everybody can get a hands on the book that he has a chapter in, The Ethics Left and Right, edited by Bob Fisher. Dustin's essay in that book is fantastic. I've read it already, so give that a look. Dustin, thank you again. Any closing remarks? Are we good?
Yeah, I think we're good. Yeah, thanks again for inviting me.
Of course. Thanks for coming back on. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.